With the release of Eden's Gate, a familiar face has come back to terrorize raiders in Final Fantasy XIV once more. The infamous Titan made his return, this time with some new tricks up his sleeve. But in his debut as a final fight of a Savage tier, Titan brought somewhat of a new challenge to the table. While he was once known for his unforgiving landslides and his punishing mechanics, Titan this time around boasted one of the most difficult DPS checks of a recent raid tier, even giving hardcore players somewhat of a challenge in the first week. This marks a change in the design philosophy coming from Square Enix, and in this video we will discuss how looking at Titan Savage through the perspective of gear progression reveals how the dev team designed Titan such that even new raiders could triumph over a tight DPS check with a little bit of help. But before we begin, I would like to take a minute to address some things from my last video. I'm really happy with how receptive you all were, and I felt that I didn't give enough credit to Matai, or Rag'ger Deathblow from Cactuar, who has been doing all the visual direction. These videos would not be possible without all of his hard work. Also, thanks for all the feedback. Although I took a long time to process what I wanted to do, moving forward, hopefully look to see videos that are more applicable to the current and future state of Final Fantasy XIV, releasing every month or two. Finally, I'm going to do my best to keep this video as accessible as possible. I recognize not everyone will know all the fights I use as examples, so I'm going to try to explain all the necessary information. So please, bear with me. Returning to Titan, to understand how mechanical design plays into gear progression, we must first take a departure into the axes that we use to judge a mechanic's difficulty. For any given mechanic, difficulty as a whole can be broken down into a few factors. First, we have what we normally think of when we talk about the difficulty of a fight, how hard it is to execute. This can be further broken down into other qualities like how fast the mechanic is or how much team communication it requires. Questions to ask when thinking about this type of difficulty are, can we assign set spots for this mechanic, and how much time do I have to figure out where I need to go for this mechanic? Next up is how punishing the mechanic is. This is judging how bad the consequences are when someone fails the mechanic. An example of a mechanic that is not very punishing is the first Evil Earth in Titan. Evil Earth is a simple ground AoE attack that kills anyone who stands inside it, and is shortly followed by a few instances of raid-wide damage. The key here is that if someone gets hit by the AoE, they die, but that's the end of it. In some cases, like if the healer dies, it may cause a chain reaction of other people dying to unavoidable damage. But as a whole, someone messing up this mechanic usually causes very few deaths and does not cause a wipe. On the other hand, an example of an extremely punishing mechanic is Heaven's Fall Trio, from the Unending Coil of Bahamut. In this mechanic, 8 towers spawn on the outer edge of the arena, and the players must be knocked back into their respective towers without being knocked back into the death wall. This mechanic is one of the more difficult parts of the fight, and is incredibly punishing. If even one player misses their tower, dying to damage, the wall, or just going to the wrong spot, the party wipes. Note that difficulty to execute and severity of punishment are not necessarily linked. There are examples of all sorts of combinations across both spectrums. A quick example of a mechanic that is very easy to execute, but severely punishing, is placing the first healer jails in Titan. For this mechanic, the healers just have to be far enough away from each other, or else the boss eventually gets a damage up and one-shots the whole party. Because this mechanic always happens at the same part, and always targets the healers, it's very easy to execute. But if it's messed up, it's a guaranteed wipe. When judging a mechanic, we should also keep in mind the diffusion of responsibility. If we keep in mind that the distribution of skill across a raid group is generally not equal, we can also use mechanical responsibility to judge difficulty. How many players have to deal with this mechanic? Does everybody have a role to play? Can one person carry the rest of the group, with callouts or by being able to take on extra roles if other party members forget? An example of a generally equal responsibility would be mechanics like Sin and Punishment followed by the towers in Voidwalker. Each player has to stack with their partner, then go to soak their respective towers. As we'll get into later, almost all of Titan's second phase has very lopsided diffusion of responsibility, which helps downplay punishment and allow gear progression to shine through. And finally, there are a few miscellaneous things to consider when looking at a fight as a whole. One is the DPS check. This one is straightforward, and the most obviously important one when thinking about how gear helps with clearing a fight. Another thing is the difficulty curve. Is the last phase the hardest phase? Interestingly, in Titan, it's pretty much exactly the opposite. The first phase is the hardest. This contributes to making Titan an accessible fight, as groups don't have to play a perfect 8 minutes to even practice the hardest phase, unlike other fights where difficulty spikes at the end. So how does all of this play into gear progression? The best way to answer that is to isolate a few aspects of difficulty: DPS checks and heal checks, punishment, and diffusion of responsibility. It goes without saying that getting better gear simplifies both DPS checks and heal checks. More stats equals more damage equals more capability for mistakes. You get the picture. But it's important to note that allowing more mistakes on the DPS side is only part of what makes Titan killable through gear. It's obvious that the difference between a fight that's killable with 1 death and a fight that requires 0 deaths to meet the DPS check is huge. First clears are often by the skin of your teeth, so as raiders, we look for as much leeway as we can get. But it's possible for fights to deny you that leeway, even in the presence of gear. This is where punishment and diffusion of responsibility come into play. The best way to understand this is to refer back to Heaven's Fall Trio from the Unending Coil Bahamut, and compare it with the main mechanic of Titan, which is the orange, yellow, and blue markers. As discussed earlier in the video, messing up Heaven's Fall Trio is basically a wipe, barring ridiculously high HP to survive the tower explosion. No amount of gearing is going to save you from going all the way back to Twintania after messing up that mechanic. In this instance, gear has no effect on the outcome of Heaven's Fall Trio. But let's contrast that with Tectonic Uplift from the second phase of Titan. In Tectonic Uplift, Titan splits the arena into 4 quadrants and proceeds to assign players orange, yellow, and blue markers depending on their role. Since all the markers explode and hit tiles on the ground based on where you're standing, the most common way to mess up this mechanic is to go to the wrong tile and accidentally hit someone else with your marker explosion. We can generalize these mistakes into a few groups. First, hitting anywhere from one other person to the whole party with your blue marker. This causes everyone in the tiles next to you to die, which can be a wipe if you hit everyone, or at least your healers. Next, standing on top of someone else with your yellow marker. This causes the people you are stacked with to die. Finally, standing on someone else with your orange marker. This basically has the same effect as standing on someone else with your yellow marker, causing everyone you're stacked with to die. It's important to note that these Tectonic Uplift mechanics generally involve party members spreading out, so it is very rare to see more than a few players stacked on top of each other at a time. So this means in 2 out of the 3 cases, usually 2 players die, and in 1 case, an undetermined number of people will die. This means that generally, when this mechanic is messed up, only a few people will die and you can raise them and keep going, minus the very rare situation where all your res are stacking each other and die. Also, Tectonic Uplift is followed by a simple DPS check in Rock Throw, and then dodging mechanics like Evil Earth. This means that if your healers didn't die, they can spend time raising and recovering. The effect of weakness when beating the DPS check from Rock Throw can be compensated for through better gear, and a minute or 2 later, everything should be back on track as though no one had made any mistakes at all. The only real lasting effect here is that the boss has a bit more HP, but as we discussed before, that is what gear progression is the best at compensating for. Another design intent in play here is that unequal distribution of responsibility allows for players to more easily avoid the worst case scenario of the blue marker hitting the whole party, and therefore has the secondary effect of enabling stronger gear to aid fight progression more often. An important quality of Tectonic Uplift is that one person can dictate the whole mechanic. What I mean by this is because the markers are so painfully slow to explode, one person can tell every single other person where to go. Therefore, raid groups can designate their mechanically strongest person to tell everyone else where to go, drastically reducing the chance of a major wipe-inducing mistake. To again contrast this with Heaven's Fall Trio, the towers appear only a few seconds before they explode, and it's very difficult to get a view of the whole arena, so you have to rely on each player to find their tower and position themselves individually. It is not possible for one player to dictate positions to the other 7, and therefore the only way to reduce the number of wipes to this mechanic is to practice it over and over again. In summary, Titan was designed, either knowingly or unknowingly, to have its difficulty severely reduced by gear progression, more so than any other final fight in the game. While I use the Unending Coil of Bahamut as my main comparison in this video, which might be considered unfair because it is an ultimate fight, you can easily substitute in other mechanics like Hello World from Final Omega or Gavel from Brute Justice to make the same point. From one point of view, you can simply understand this section as making mechanics easier makes gear progression have a larger impact on your ability to clear. And overall, this is true. but what I'm really trying to stress here is the way mechanics are easier. If there's one thing to take away from this whole video, it's that the capability of gear to help players clear raids is enabled entirely through the mechanic design. While gear universally aids with DPS and heal checks, the degree that it speeds up progression varies strongly based on the punishment of the mechanics. And that's all I've got for this video. I hope that you were able to learn something new. If you liked it and want to hear more thoughts on game design, feel free to subscribe or give me a follow on Twitch or Twitter, both of which are linked in the description. As a side note, I'll be streaming my group's Alexander Ultimate progression every day until we clear, so feel free to tune in. Thanks for watching, guys. Peace.